On time, so welcome those of you who have signed on, and more will be trickling in as we go. Tonight's webinar is a little bit different than our typical approach here at BCM, and we're really delighted that you have joined us. We are going to talk almost strictly theology tonight. Typically our webinars take some social issue and look at it through the lens of Scripture. But tonight we're going to look at theology because ideas have consequences, as will be central to the conversation tonight. Theology, particularly dysfunctional or toxic theology, has had huge historic consequences, and overturning theology is a little bit like changing culture. It's a long-term proposition. So those of you who are theologically trained will either delight in this or rue it. Those of you who are not, I hope Ted and I are both committed to trying to keep things pretty straightforward. So we're going to tackle a big issue and a very hot button issue among churches and denominations these days, which is atonement theology. Its roots, its branches, its consequences. And we're really delighted that you have joined us. We're going to get going here. And thanks to Chris White, who is at the console in the other room doing the magic. And a shout out to my friend Frankie Adechiga, who's visiting from LA today and sitting in on his first webinar. Well, today, as you know, and this week is Passover. We celebrate and commemorate the great Jewish feast of liberation, in which Moses led an enslaved people to freedom. Yesterday, and the full moon was the first day of Passover. It'll be going all this week, and as usual, it correlates with Holy Week. In the spirit of liberation struggles, and because it's April and baseball is back, I want to bring to mind the anniversary of two very key moments in the civil rights history of the United States, the modern American Exodus narrative. On this day in 1947, Jackie Roosevelt Robinson became the first African American to play in a Major League Baseball game in the 20th century. By stepping onto Ebbets Field as a Brooklyn Dodger, he broke the color line in professional sports. And many analysts of the civil rights movement reckon that this cultural act was as significant as anything that the political civil rights movement did in terms of changing culture. Oh, by the way, Jackie started at first base, and although he went 0 for 3, the Dodgers beat the Braves that day 5-3. 20 years later came another milestone in the movement. Amidst growing opposition to the war in Vietnam, large-scale anti-war protests were held in New York, San Francisco, and other cities. In New York, the protests began in Central Park and concluded at the United Nations. People were burning draft cards, and the featured speaker was none other than Martin Luther King Jr., who just 11 days earlier had broken his own public silence about the war in Indochina in giving his fateful and consequential Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church. So this day in Exodus history is one to be mindful of, as we always try to do, locating ourselves in time. Obviously, this is also Holy Week for us Christians, which itself is an intensely political narrative in our Gospels. The week begins with the popular demonstration at the gates of the capital city, led by Jesus of Nazareth, who is invoking messianic hope. Obviously, that's something that we commemorate in our churches on Palm Sunday. If you want to review these themes, you might want to order the archived version of our Palm Sunday webinar that we did last year. It's a way to brush up on some of these issues. The Holy Week narrative obviously ends, of course, with the arrest, conviction, and execution of Jesus. And that brings us to the topic of this Holy Week webinar. What is the meaning of the death of Jesus? As a historical datum, the execution of Jesus of Nazareth by the Roman authorities is one of the most reliable we have, but its political and theological meaning continue to be hotly debated among academics, between denominational tendencies, and even amidst popular culture. For example, this is the 10th anniversary of Mel Gibson's blockbuster film, The Passion of the Christ, which cinematically reduced the meaning of the life of Jesus to an extended meditation on his suffering and death. I think it was about 2 hours long. But Gibson's film, while rife with Catholic pieties, essentially was only reiterating what 1,000 years of Christian theology has taught about Jesus' death as a cosmic atonement event in which the Son of God takes on the sins of the world and of thee and me. But a millennium of what is called substitutionary atonement theology is being challenged from a variety of angles over the last 2 decades. And some of you might be familiar with some of these books. It's regular cottage industry. Everybody's writing an atonement book. And so things are really in flux these days. But in my opinion, this book, which just came out about a year ago, is one of the best overviews of this debate, and indeed one of the best arguments. It is available from Whip and Stock. I really hope that you will avail yourself of this book for all the reasons that we're going to be talking about. Here's what I wrote on the back cover as a blurb for Instead of Atonement. In the last quarter century, the theology and ethics of retributive justice have come under long overdue critical scrutiny. Practical experiments in peacemaking and restorative justice are challenging conventional wisdom, animating social imagination, and inspiring radical revisions of traditional atonement theology. Ted Grimsrud, in my opinion, one of our most reliable first world theologians, provides the most concise, readable, and compelling summary to date of the biblical case for the turn to restorative justice. This book will help empower a revolutionary reclamation of a healing Christian faith for our violent times. These claims are big claims, but I don't think they're overstated. Ted has done a magnificent job. Ted is the professor of theology and peace studies and chair of the Bible and Religion department at Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia. He's also served for 10 years as a pastor in Mennonite churches in Arizona, Oregon, and South Dakota. Ted did his doctoral studies at the Graduate Theological Union, my alma mater, and focuses his work on the connection between Christian theology and pacifism. In the emails that Chris sent out, you have the links to Ted's very widely read theological blogs on theology and peace. So Ted, welcome. We're really glad to have you. You see Ted in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. He's beaming in from Harrisonburg, Virginia. Ted, you say you wrote the book mostly from a desire that Christian faith be part of the solution instead of part of the problem when it comes to violence, retribution, and domination. That's a tall order, but I think you've tackled it well.
Well, thanks, Chad. It's sure great to be here, and I appreciate your kind words on the book and tonight. I think that, the motivation really to write the book came from, in a way, it goes back to my own experience. When I first became a Christian when I was a teenager, I was taught that God was a God of war, basically, and ever since then, I mean, it took a while to kind of move away from that approach to Christianity, and ever since then, it's kind of been I've had this sense that there are currents in Christianity that really do make Christianity part of the problem, not part of the solution of violence in the world, and that a particularly helpful part of the process for me of thinking about this was becoming friends with a colleague here at Eastern Mennonite University, Howard Zehr, who's been, profoundly involved in the restorative justice movement. And Howard actually introduced me to a book by a guy named Timothy Grimsrud called God's Just Vengeance that really makes the case historically for a certain understanding of the atonement having really a direct consequence in terms of criminal justice philosophy in the Western world, and just on down to the present, to where, like today in the United States, if you are a Christian, you're more likely to support capital punishment, you're more likely to support war, you're more likely to support violence against children.
Right. Well, that's a little bit about why, and we'll come back to that again. But let's, for a minute, talk about how you've done this book. It seems to me that there are three characteristics of this book, and there are all reasons to commend it to our audience tonight. First of all, this is a very readable book. It's not filled with technical theological jargon. I think that was very intentional on your part. Secondly, it's not sort of a defensive, pacifist apologia for violence in the Bible or for violent atonement theory. Instead, you've spent really your energy trying to be constructive and make a case for a non-retributive atonement-based theology. And thirdly, and in my opinion, most importantly, you've not only stated your opinion, but you've argued your case that a central doctrine or a ubiquitous doctrine like atonement theology really needs to be accountable to Scripture, as opposed to the typical approach among theologians, which is to fit Scripture into dogmatic theology. Comments on either adding to this list or unpacking some of these characteristics of this book?
Well, I would say that in terms of the first point, I really do write mainly as a pastor, someone who teaches undergraduate students, an ethicist who is deeply interested in theology, but I think that most of the stuff I write in one way or another I have taught and preached, and so I really seek to kind of speak to people in very direct ways about the stuff that I think is really actually very, I think theology and doctrine are very practical and very relevant when they serve faithful living. I think that one of the things I've become convinced of for a long time, and that really energizes this book, is the sense that the Bible really tells us a story that's quite a bit different than the Western theological tradition, and especially in relation to many issues, but certainly in relation to this issue of atonement, of salvation, of which really comes ultimately down to kind of our understanding of God and how God relates to humanity. And the central motif in a lot of the Western atonement theology has been that God is this mixture of mercy and justice, and God's justice or God's holiness or God's honor or whatever need to be satisfied in order for God to be able to act merciful toward humanity. And it just seems to me that you can find Scripture that supports that idea, but when you just go back and read the story itself from start to finish, it's a story where God is not constrained by needing to satisfy honor or justice. It's so that going to Scripture first over the doctrine actually gets you better doctrine.
Ted, do you have your volume turned up all the way there on your end?
Yeah.
Okay, you might just lean in a little bit closer to where your microphone is, wherever that is on your computer. Folks are saying they're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you, so just do the best you can without throwing your back out there, brother.
Sure, and I'll try to maybe speak a little louder too.
Yeah, that's good. That's better. In the first chapter of this book, and friends, we're going to try to really overview this book for you in the next hour because it's just such an important book, in my opinion. In the first chapter, you really state the problem. You've already alluded to the fact that Christians, even today, are disproportionately supportive of retributive notions of justice, whether that's criminal justice system or international war system, or even the household. Um, you really think that retributive atonement theology underlies a great deal of the problem of violence in our society and culture, both historically and at present. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, one way to say it is that, and maybe this is an optimistic view of humanity, but I still think it's true that we really need some kind of, in general, we need some kind of rationale to do violence against other human beings, and the basic kind of rationale that fuels a lot of violence is the sense that when somebody does something wrong, they need to be punished, and this certainly enters into thinking about war. It enters into thinking about how to respond to children, the use of corporal punishment, but also very much in terms of how we respond to wrongdoing, to violations of laws of kind of social welfare, and that that what is needed is that there be a response of pain, responding to the violence that has been done, and then what happens is it basically sets off a spiral or reinforces a spiral of violence, and as we see in our criminal justice practices, which is what I kind of use as my example in the book, you have a punitive criminal justice system that doesn't that makes people more violent and makes our society more violent, and we kind of add this violence and injustice and pain onto trauma, and things just keep going and going. And that ultimately this is grounded in a view of God or a view of reality, which says that that's what happens, that you pay back, you have to pay back. God pays back.
So much so that I think it's fair to say that for many Americans, Christian or not, the idea of justice is fundamentally wedded to the idea of retribution, that ultimately, for ultimate justice to be served, somebody's got to pay. And this is theologically understood as the ultimate justice of God will be retribution. Now, in preparing for this webinar, I was curious, so I looked up the etymology of retribution. You see that here on the slide, repayment, recompense. It has its roots, however, all the way back in the Latin tribuere, to assign or allot. Now, of course, in the Roman imperial system, subjects of the empire had to pay tribute. They were assigned tribute. They had to pay empire not to be violent toward them. It was a little bit like a protection scheme, and that's very interesting that underlies our notion of justice. That ultimately we make sacrifices, we make payments so that we won't be punished by a superior power. Why do you think this is such a deep-seated assumption about the nature of the universe, Ted?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it seems like it is certainly built into a lot of kind of cultural practices and lots of different cultures. The notion of revenge, of paying people back. I think partly it's related to how a desire for security or safety, and out of fear that you need to kind of retaliate in order to prevent yourself being totally overwhelmed or whatever. It seems like what has happened, though, in our culture is that the state got involved, and the sense of where you have, just instead of just having an individual kind of responding to another individual, it ends up being the state responds, and the violence just increases.
Hmm. Well, before we launch into your counter argument, can you summarize the sort of classic statement of retributive atonement theology? Because it will be very familiar to all of us who will have heard it one way or another. Can you sort of give us a concise definition of the thousand-year tradition of retributive atonement?
Sure. Basically, the problem is that humanity has broken God's laws. God is a holy God who cannot look upon sin, or cannot look upon, God has to respond, because God is holy, because God is just. God has to respond to these violations with punishment, and there's nothing that we can do to, as human beings, as sinful human beings, there's nothing that we can do to counter that or to prevent that. But God doesn't want to just destroy humanity, so God has to create another option, which is that God can, that God became human, and as human, God lived perfectly without sin, and then this God human gives up his life in a violent death and takes the punishment, takes the what we deserve in our place, and then we trust in him as our, in Jesus as our Savior, and basically the dynamic, the punishment or the violence is kind of overpowers the problem. The problem is human sin, and the solution is a payment that is just as made by the perfect human who didn't sin on our behalf as a substitute for the punishment we deserve.
Right. Now, obviously, many Christians, most Christians have heard this and internalized this in one sense or another, and somewhat uncritically assume that this sort of notion of a sacrificial atonement must surely be rooted in the old sacrificial system of the Hebrew Bible. So that's where you start. You start with an argument from Torah. Do you want to give us a summary of the argument that you make from the
Sure.
Torah?
Yeah. Well, it actually, the idea would be that the very initial kind of saving act that God does in the story in the Old Testament is really calling Abraham and Sarah, and this is an act, and the story makes it clear that Abraham and Sarah do not deserve this. There's nothing that they satisfy in God. Before that, humanity has rebelled against God, and really nothing has changed. And God just acts. God just calls them out of God's mercy. And then this people that God creates end up, in slavery in Egypt, and then God again and again. The emphasis is that there's nothing that they do to satisfy God, nothing they do to kind of get leverage over against God, but God simply acts on their behalf to liberate them from slavery. And then God gives them Torah as a gift to guide their life as free people in the ways of justice and shalom. The story continues with success and failure, and then ultimately there's a kind of a major failure, and the Babylonians wipe out the kingdom of Israel, and then once again God acts kind of unilaterally to restore the people, making it very clear that God, in each of these three kind of key moments, God does not receive a payment. There's really no. It's not like there's not retribution in the story, certainly, or punishment or judgment, that's certainly part of the story, but the basic core dynamic of how salvation works is that it is simply a gift from God.
Well, that would come as a surprise to many Christians, I suppose. But you've made a pretty compelling case for the way in which God takes initiative toward people, and how God's initiative always uh, offers a very concrete liberation from actual circumstances on earth. Um, so then, what is Israel's cult about? What is the sacrificial system about if it's not trying to buy God's favor?
Right, and I think that's really a key question, because I think many Christians assume that sacrificial system was precisely about that, in effect, buying God's favor, and that the failure was a failure. The problem wasn't with the sacrificial system per se. Problem which required, again, payment to gain God's favor. The problem was that the people just couldn't do it well enough. So then the whole system is then reinforced in what Jesus came to do. But actually, I think the story itself, from the very start, presents the sacrificial system as the set up to help the people respond to the gift that they've been given. And the same thing with the laws. The laws, the Torah, the commandments weren't given, okay, you follow these and then you'll find salvation. It's because you have been given salvation, then you follow these laws as a response to help you live as saved people, and you practice the sacrifices as a response to help you live as saved people. The most central dynamic in the sacrifices were sacrifices of gratitude. The sacrifices were an expression of the people's gratitude to God for what God had given them. But the sacrifices were also available to help them deal with problems as they arose, but not in order to gain God's favor, but really more for themselves, to give them something concrete to help them understand that there had been a problem, that was acknowledged, and then they can move ahead.
At one point in this chapter, you say that Leviticus 17:11 seems to say that the key in the blood sacrifice system is that the blood symbolizes life, not death. The power in the blood that is not related to death or punishment, blood is a reminder of the power of life and of the giver of life to overcome sin and evil. That seems to be alluding to the notion of the Noahic covenant, that the life is in the blood. That's a pretty important reframing, isn't it?
It is, and it needs to be borne in mind then when we get to the New Testament, and particularly in the writings of Paul, when there's allusion to blood, that it's just the lens that we look at that is so important. Do we think of blood as mainly being something is killed? What matters is that it's killed, or is blood more the metaphor or the symbol of life, and that the picture is a reinforcement of life? And I think if you look at the whole story in the way I've been talking about, then that becomes more clear how that fits together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You next try to capture the ethos of the prophets and the prophetic literature. And that is also another place that Christians like to cite as the legitimation of judgment as retribution. Well, weren't the prophets always calling down judgment on the people and threatening the people with God's anger and God's potential retribution? And so how do you find the theology of grace being articulated in the Hebrew prophets?
Well, I think first of all, maybe the most fundamental point there would be that the solution that the prophets offer is just simply to turn back, to repent. That the basic idea, as I see it, is that the picture is that God is there, ready to embrace the people. The problem is that people have turned away from God. We're worshipped idols, come back into the oppression of empire. And the prophets are saying, this is the way of death. The answer, though, is not that you, the answer is simply to turn back. And I think, for example, in the book of Amos, which is maybe one of the most judgment-oriented book, and is also a book that maybe presents the strongest kind of theology of justice, it seems very important to recognize that those are two separate things in Amos. The judgment, the justice is the alternative to judgment. If you do justice, if you turn back and do justice, then you will experience life. It's not that judgment itself is not the expression of God's justice.
You talk about the prophets identifying 4 major ways in which the people have wandered off the path, off the way of Torah. One is by injustice, particularly social and economic injustice. A second is violence. A third is idolatry. And a fourth is what you call vain religiosity, that is ritual disconnected from justice, which reinforces the illusion that the community can tolerate injustice, violence, and idolatry while still connecting through ritual. It seems to me that what you're saying there is a form of religion very much familiar to us in modernity. That is, if we do certain religious ritual, we will somehow buy off God's displeasure with all the things that we're not doing in the real world. You want to say something more about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's the problem I would say is that something like ritual becomes kind of autonomous or an end in itself and not part of the process for serving shalom. So the ritual, like with other aspects of Torah, like with the theology of the sacrifices, that all of this is meant to serve justice, you could say, to serve shalom, to serve the community's wholeness. And when they become separate from that and become ends in themselves, then you can have a thing where you in our day, you go to church, you take communion, you give your offerings, you pray and all this stuff, and then you go back out and pilot a drone or run a bank, one of the big banks that drives people out of their homes or that sort of thing. That the ritual religiosity isn't serving justice, and I think that's really the main part of the critique of the prophets in that regard. That certainly is reinforced by Jesus and Paul.
Let's turn to the Jesus story, as you do in your book. But first, let me just say to all of our friends online, we are happy to take questions as they come up. I'm sure lots is bubbling. Feel free to chat in questions. I'll try to make a note of them and address them to Ted as time goes on. Rather than saving all your questions to the end, we'll try to take them as we go. But also be patient, because Ted is building a case throughout the broad scope of the biblical narrative, so you might just want to keep listening. You next move to the Jesus story, and I think this statement that I've quoted here is really important. When we read the Gospels against the backdrop of the Old Testament, and not against the backdrop of post-biblical Christian theology, we see complete continuity between the core Old Testament salvation story and Jesus' own teaching about salvation. Jesus follows the prophets and Torah in his basic equation. God initiates salvation always. God does this out of love and with the intent to heal an alienated human race. So in other words, you're arguing that you really cannot base a retributive theology in the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus is simply continuing that tradition. Now, that's a pretty major claim that might surprise many of us who have heard so often that the Old Testament is about retribution and violence, and Jesus and the New Testament are about love. You're saying no, it's fundamental continuity.
Yeah, I mean, one major thing would be to say that the Old Testament salvation story is about a gift, is about God's mercy. That is the central thing, without a need for a violent sacrifice and that sort of thing. So one claim is that there's continuity. The Old Testament is way more merciful, way more peace oriented. And then the other one, the other point would be that really, I mean, it's really ironic in Christian history and Christian understanding of salvation that we pay so little attention to what Jesus himself actually said and did about salvation or in relation to salvation. And I don't know, it's just shocking to me, really, when I think about that, because it's so clear once you look at Jesus' own life and teaching, that for one thing, he is basically over and over saying that he is the fulfillment, or he's in continuity with the Old Testament, and he's also saying that that I just come to give you salvation as a gift, to get, probably the thing that got him, one of the main things that got him in trouble was that he forgave people's sins. He bypassed the temple. He bypassed any sense of satisfaction or sacrifice, and just showed God's mercy to people. And he said he's doing that in the same way that the prophets taught that, and that's the same way that the whole story has presented it. So his debate, or his critique, was not of the Old Testament. It was a critique of people in his day who were interpreting it in other ways.
And one of the major evidences you have for that in the Jesus story is healing as an expression of God's love and salvation. That Jesus, as a healer, is freely offering the gift of healing as a concrete expression of salvation. The second point that you make in this chapter on the Jesus story is that Jesus, acting as a prophetic critic of those in power, he is just, again, following in the footsteps of the prophetic tradition of mediating grace by calling out injustice. So healing and prophetic critique seem to be the two of the major signs of God's initiative through Jesus.
Yeah, and they're kind of two parts, the two sides of one coin. That by healing, he was critiquing, and that but it's also really remarkable. Like one of my favorite passages is in the Gospel of Matthew. You have this in chapter 5 of Matthew, this statement that Jesus went around healing and teaching, and then you have the Sermon on the Mount, and then right after the Sermon on the Mount, you have this story or this series of encounters where Jesus heals people, and then after the healing stories, that same verse is repeated. So it's you kind of have this whole picture of the teaching and healing together. And when you look at who he healed, he was really indiscriminate. He healed Romans, he healed women, he healed poor people, he healed children, he healed Jewish leaders, and of course, this meant he was going to get in trouble.
And of course, he does get in trouble, and that brings us now to the thorny question of Jesus' death. Now, at this point in the book, about a third of the way through, as you now approach the question of Jesus' death and its role in salvation, you offer the reader three basic options. Do you want to walk us through these three? Because I think it's a pretty important map of the book.
Yeah, well, they're like, what I'm asking is, basically, why did Jesus get killed, just in terms of the story, and that basically he, one way to think about it is that he got in trouble for three different, he challenged three different kind of institutions or three different, or you could say powers, principalities and powers. And in each case, he was very much in continuity with the story before him, the prophets, Torah, and in each case, they kind of led to an escalation of the conflict. The first one that I talk about is the conflict with the I call it the cultural exclusivism, and in the story.
Before we get to that, Ted, I want to just look at these three options that you offer us. What you're telling us is that as we approach Jesus' death, if we assume the logic of retribution.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question, Chet.
Yeah, that's okay. As it's on the slide here, we think, if we think with the logic of retribution, and quite frankly, most Christian theology does, then inevitably we minimize the significance of Jesus' teaching and an embodiment of love. The second option that you offer is that if we focus on Jesus' message of love, what do we do with his violent death? Do we just simply say it was tragic and evil, but really doesn't have much to add in terms of how we love, how we understand salvation? This might be archetypally characterized as the Quaker reading of the tradition, or that Jesus was a great but tragic wise man. The third option that you take in the second half of the book is that, in fact, the death of Jesus is crucial for how we understand the Bible salvation story. And it does add something to the Bible salvation story, but it doesn't cancel out anything. That it is in continuity. And that's the case that you want to make in the second half of the book.
Yeah, that's right. And probably that would be one of the main contributions that I would say my argument's trying to make, that is a little bit different, or maybe a lot different. That I want to say really that Jesus' death was not necessary. Jesus' death, God didn't need Jesus to die. The salvation was already there in its fullness, the very start, so that Jesus' death as a basis for salvation is not what the story is telling us. But at the same time, clearly the New Testament, certainly the Gospels, but also very much what follows, talks about Jesus' death as really important. And so then the question is, can these two things go together? Can you still affirm kind of the biblical picture that Jesus' death is really important and really something very major in what God is doing in the world, while at the same time saying Jesus' death was not a necessary sacrifice that God had to have in order to bring salvation? And what I'm suggesting is, if you really try to hold those two things together, that helps you see really another dimension to the story, which is basically that Jesus' death did play a major role in making clear what we're up against in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the ways that I like to put that dialectic is by focusing on the small Greek word that appears often in the gospel story. And the Greek word is dei, D-E-I, would be the transliteration. And it's usually translated, it is necessary. So Luke tells us it is necessary that Messiah should suffer. And of course, that's been used as part of the phalanx of proof texts of retributive atonement. It was necessary that Jesus should suffer. Actually, the Greek word could equally well be translated inevitable. Has to do with the structure of the world. And so we could say something like, Jesus' death was not necessary given the character of God, meaning God didn't demand Jesus to die. But Jesus' death was inevitable given the character of the powers, or given the character of the state. And that's a whole different reading, which is precisely the reading that you offer in this book. And so now we Now we come to the piece that you started in on, which is why is it inevitable? What was Jesus up against? And you name these three great institutions, and just walk us through them.
Okay, so the and it's a little bit complicated because I think these three institutions in the Bible, and I kind of go through the kind of whole biblical perspective on the law, the temple, and the empire, and they're presented somewhat in different ways, and I think I've already said, and the book makes a point that the law is good. The problem isn't the law, but the conflict Jesus had was over how the law would be interpreted, and basically, I mean, this would be the argument that for reasons that were probably really good in a lot of ways, the community saw the law as a way of enforcing boundaries that provided the community with a sense of a separate identity, so it wouldn't just be absorbed in the wider world. But in establishing the law or applying the law in terms of enforcing these boundaries, things like circumcision and kosher eating and those things in particular, it ended up being kind of the basis for excluding people and doing violence. And the Gospels present this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees really being centered around that. Now, I think there's a real legitimate concern that we not take the gospel picture of the Pharisees as the total picture of the Pharisees, and that this not become something of Christianity versus Judaism. I would argue that basically this conflict is a conflict in the story within Judaism, and it has become a conflict within Christianity of how do we understand our convictions? Are they the basis to kind of welcome people into this basic vocation of blessing all the families of the earth, or are the basis to provide a sense of exclusion and separatism over against, and that we do violence in order to protect those boundaries? And the temple, though, I think is less positive in the story, and it was really the conflict with the temple leaders, especially over the issue of forgiveness and the necessity of kind of going through the temple, and just the extreme power that the temple authorities had in the culture that really got Jesus into trouble. And then I think kind of behind all that, and really what is in some ways buttressing the temple dynamic would be the empire, the Roman Empire. And you kind of have to look, and I know, Ched, you've done a lot of work on this. I mean, I think you have to kind of look carefully, because the Gospels don't just spell it out that the empire is a big problem. Or certainly our English translations and our theological tradition. But I think clearly, ultimately, it was the empire that killed Jesus. And so in all three of these cases, Jesus was practicing a way of life that was free from the domination of these institutions. And that's what got him in trouble, because he was showing a way that undermined this authority, which ultimately was authority of domination. And this is, I think, where the dynamic of retribution comes in, because it is precisely because Jesus is undermining the authority of these institutions that they fought back, and they practice retribution. And so, as this quote says, the logic of retribution is an instrument of the powers. It's not God's instrument. It's exposed by Jesus as being against God.
Mm-hmm. Participant, those of you who have not read the book need to understand that each of these three aspects that Jesus of Nazareth was struggling with are given an entire chapter in Ted's book. So he's trying to synopsize a longer argument. He does sort of summarize it at the end of these three chapters by saying the logic of retribution led the powers of cultural exclusivism, which Ted looks at mostly in terms of some of the skirmishes with the Pharisees in the local villages, to seek to destroy Jesus, even if ultimately they were unable to do so. That in turn led the powers of religious institutionalism, namely the temple authorities, to actually take steps to arrest Jesus, try him, and turn him over to the Romans for punishment. It was the powers of political authoritarianism that actually took the final step and used the state's ultimate tool of punishment to execute Jesus. So it's an elegant sort of map that Ted draws from the gospel evidence that shows these interlocking principalities and powers that finally conspire to execute Jesus. Now, Weldon Nicely, Ted, is asking to what extent you've been influenced by René Girard's work on the scapegoat and sacrificial violence. You don't talk too much about that in this book, but I know you're aware of that particular vector of the atonement critical theologies.
Yeah, I think probably that would be Girard's influence would be something where I kind of internalized it. I spent some time a number of years ago reading Girard and reading some of the Girardians. Found a lot of what they said to be very helpful, particularly the basic idea, or one of the basic ideas from Girard would be the idea that the violence that of the sacrificial violence is not from God. Sacrificial violence is just violence, and that Jesus is the kind of scapegoat, and that because Jesus was, Girard uses the term innocent. I prefer the term good, saying there's a sense in which Jesus was guilty of violating the standards of these institutions, but because he was good and then he still was scapegoated and killed, that exposes the scapegoat dynamic as being rebellious against God. And I think, in my book, that's kind of in the background, but I don't actually directly talk about Girard, and maybe partly because I hope to do more work in the future, kind of on the development of atonement theology and later Christianity. Here, I really was trying to just focus on kind of recapturing the biblical story, and Girard certainly helps us read the Bible for sure. Mm-hmm. And some of Girard's people who've worked with Girard, biblical scholars who worked with Girard, do that very well. Mm-hmm. So I'm very sympathetic and find Girard's stuff helpful. I think when I sat down and wrote the book, it was just kind of in the background of my mind. I didn't have Girard's stuff on my desk as I was doing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Clive Slaughter there in the Atlanta area, welcome back to the webinar, Clive, wonders if you would address Jesus' self-understanding of his own anticipated death. In other words, as the Gospels present the story, Jesus seems to be portending his own fate, and you do address that in your treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complicated question because I think the liturgy, kind of the way the story is told in the church, in some ways is reflecting a more sacrificial theology. Like Ched, you alluded at the very beginning to Mel Gibson's movie, which is extreme kind of expression of that. But I think Gibson's movie in some ways is still reflecting the theology of tradition. I think Jesus clearly understood that I think back to the inevitability vis-a-vis the necessity, that it was inevitable that he would die, and that part of the power of his life, and this would be, if I'm going to say, okay, this is maybe getting ahead a little bit, but how it is that Jesus' death is understood as being something that is part of the salvation story. One of the main ways that it is that there's the way he lived in face of knowing he almost for sure was going to die. Not that his death was going to be something that changed God's disposition towards humanity, but that his death was pretty much inevitable because of how he was challenging the powers, and that he continued to live the same way. And so in that sense, he models a way of life. And I certainly would believe that the liturgy, kind of Eucharistic liturgy, can be reoriented to convey that. But as a Mennonite, I haven't done a lot of work with that. I think, though, that I think it would take a little bit of work, because I think certainly most people, when they go through the Mass or Book of Common Prayer, the Episcopalian version or whatever, they have in mind this traditional kind of theology.
Yes, yeah, very much so. Well, I think it's pretty clear from the gospel stories that how Jesus understands the inevitability of his own death, and indeed how he passes on that vocation to the disciples, that what happens to me will also happen to you, is never ever in the Gospels articulated in terms of God needs this or God wants this. It's always rather interpreted in terms of the prophetic legacy. This is what they did to the prophets. This is what they do to me. This is what they did to John the Baptist. This is what they'll do to you. There's no retributive atonement there. It's more sort of a political realism from the prophetic perspective. And I think that is something that often completely gets lost in our tradition. So Jesus lived a true life, as you say, a good life, not necessarily an innocent life from the perspective of the powers. I think that's an important point you make in this book. And now you come to the story of the resurrection, which, interesting, is a word you don't use in the title of that chapter. And I love the way you say this. The events of Easter Sunday took everyone by surprise. On the other hand, this event would not have been unimaginable for those who, as was common, believed in the eventual bodily resurrection of people of the covenant. So you're nicely stating how this was both a radical novum and yet also not outside it wasn't unintelligible. You then go on to say that by raising Jesus from the dead, God essentially says yes to Jesus, to his way of life. Now this idea of resurrection as vindication, or what Marcus Barth wrote in a great book in the early 60s, acquittal by resurrection. That's still not deeply understood in the Christian tradition. Could you say something about resurrection as vindication of this counterintuitive way of restorative justice?
Yeah, I think one of the key thoughts there would be just the need to really hold together all the parts of the story, so that it is Jesus' life that reveals kind of the character of God and God's ways with humanity by reinforcing the message of Torah and the prophets. That then gets him in trouble, that leads to the cross. He is killed. He is executed by the agents of, the so-called agents of God, the religion, the state, who in a sense, are saying that the way he lived was not true. And then by God bringing him back, God basically is saying that, no, this life was true. And in fact, the people who killed Jesus were agents of Satan. They were rebelling. They were not. And this is one of the main places where Jesus, the story of Jesus is contributes to biblical salvation story, is that Jesus is revealing in the most profound possible way that these institutions that demand human loyalty are against God. They aren't God's agents, and I think you can go back to the Old Testament. What got the people in trouble? What got the community in trouble? I mean, what led Israel down the path away from Torah? And it was the same kind of thing. The idolatry, which basically was allowing the ways of empire, ways of injustice, the ways of exclusion, to seem to people as if that's what God wanted, and or the gods wanted, or whatever. And so Jesus' resurrection is just kind of the definitive expression of God's endorsement of Jesus' path over against these idols, which, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear of this story, will be freeing for them and contribute to their salvation.
You kind of make 3 points about the force of Jesus' resurrection. One is God's vindication or affirmation of the way of some nonviolent restorative love. Secondly, however, you do note that this resurrection is a rebuke to the powers who attempted to quash love by retributive justice. So ultimately, the resurrection is a rebuke to retributive justice and its logic. And then the third point you make is that, therefore, this resurrection verifies that love and perseverance really does lie at the heart of the universe. Those are really, really powerful cosmological claims that you make, and I think you're right that they need to be understood at the heart of the meaning of resurrection, which is why we dismiss the importance of the resurrection at great cost if we're trying to forge an alternative story.
Yeah, and I think the practical kind of ramifications of that in part would be to say that this path that Jesus led, and I think this is where a lot of the atonement theology is very problematic, because Jesus dies instead of us, instead of Jesus dies in order to empower us to die. And then the resurrection is why we can do that.
Now, you then tackle Paul, and I'm seeing here that Jamie is bringing in something that I think might help us segue briefly to Paul. Jamie very understandably says, well, here we are in Passover, and it wasn't the Passover of the foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice. After all, you've got the blood on the doorstep and the angel of death passing over. And of course, these metaphors and images have in fact been used to portray Jesus' death as atonement, as sort of substitutionary atonement. Jesus is the Paschal Lamb, and so on. What would you say to Jamie?
I honestly don't have, I think, a very good explanation of what actually happened with the Passover, the angel of death, and all that. I think that I don't think there's any sense in which the death in that story is a sacrifice to God. So in that sense, I can't see any parallel between. I mean, I guess the main parallel. I mean, I understand the Passover, like Jesus in the Last Supper, the story of the Last Supper. Jesus talks about his death as a ransom, and the ransom, as I understand it, the kind of the core of the image there is liberation. The ransom is when people are freed, and clearly that's what's going on with the Passover, is the freeing of the people. But in terms of the role of angel of death, it's a very troubling part of the story, I think. But I just don't see any way in which the death that happens in the Exodus story is a sacrifice to God that enables God to free the people. That God's freeing the people was strictly God's initiative. And I always understand the violence really in that story as mainly being just the playing out of the violence of Pharaoh, the kind of systemic violence of and so in that sense, it's not really God doing the violence. Violence is a systemic violence.
Well, we can continue on in this vein because Tim has invited you now to address Romans, and that is exactly what you do in your chapter on Paul, is you key on Romans 1 to 3, which you call not Paul's exhaustive treatment, but his sort of representative treatment of the meaning of Jesus' death. I thought you did a really nice job with this chapter. It's some pretty heavy lifting. Do you want to address Romans 3:25 as you do in the book, as Tim asks this question that you see in your chat box there?
Well, can I just ask Tim to read it?
Well, Tim doesn't have a mic, so I'll read it to you. I realize the print's a little small. So he's saying, what are your thoughts on Romans 3:25? Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through faith. He did this to show his justice or righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over the sins previously committed. Now you directly discuss that text in your chapter on Paul.
I do, and I have to admit it's not fresh in my mind. I mean, I'm actually looking right now that I have a kind of a paraphrase of that verse, because part of the issue is really translations. But I don't seem to be able to find it right now. Okay, here we are. Well, let me just say that I think I do a great job in the book on that.
I think you do too. You really make a case that Paul is, just as Jesus was in absolute continuity with the Hebrew Bible, so Paul is in absolute continuity with Jesus in terms of understanding salvation, in terms of God's merciful intention to bring healing to a broken world. Paul does not present salvation in terms of retributive justice or a mechanistic view of God's holiness and honor. Salvation for Paul is a gift of a relational God who's seeking to free humanity from its self-destructive bondage to the powers of sin and death. You talk about Paul's sort of even-handed critique of the two great cultural systems of his day, the Roman system and the Jewish system. And Paul points out how the Roman system is corrupted by idolatry. And I think you do a nice job defining idolatry as human beings paying more attention to the work of their own hands than to the Creator. But Paul is equally critical of the way in which his his own people have taken the tradition of Torah and turned it into a franchise that excludes. And you talk about how that neither citizenship in the empire nor citizenship in ethnic Israel saves anyone. Both communities are in bondage to the power of sin. And that's why we all are so dependent on injustice and violence to sustain our societies. And then you cite the verse immediately prior to the verse that Tim has cited, Romans 3:24. All are now justified by God's grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So it's very interesting, as you point out, that the gift comes first, and then comes the sacrifice. So then how was Jesus' life and death a sacrifice? You speak to this.
Right, and I think the key idea is a distinction between the idea of self-sacrifice, that Jesus lived his life sacrificially for others to the point of death. Sacrifice in that sense, vis-a-vis sacrifice that is a sacrifice that is for God, that empowers God then to bring forgiveness in the face of God's justice or God's honor or holiness. And I think it's this particular verse that Tim cites is just so full of complicated words and translations in terms of what where I think what I try to do in the book is really, as you were saying, Ched, is to really read this in the context of the first 3 chapters of Romans. And so to say that God put forward Jesus as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood is basically saying that Jesus' life of self-sacrifice was how God overcame the powers, and that and I think a key word here would be justice. There's a whole discussion about kind of the problem. I mean, it's very complicated and controversial, the translation justice and righteousness, but I argue that the basic message here of justice is justice as reconciliation of people and God and people and each other, and so that God showed God's justice of bringing salvation or bringing healing or bringing liberation through Jesus' self-sacrifice as a to the point of, again, back to the blood as life metaphor, to the point of Jesus living this life all the way to the end. I guess that's kind of how that's answered that.
So God justifies on the grounds of faithfulness, not payment.
That's right. That's right.
And justification is offered by God's justice, and I'm here also quoting from the book. God's justice, justification is offered by God's justice as a gift apart from the works of the law, although it is attested to by the law and the prophets. So justification in the Pauline sense has to do with faithfulness, Jesus' faithfulness and our faithfulness, not with ethnic identity, not with relationship to empire, not with punitive sacrifice, not with doctrinal belief. Justification and salvation are about a living relationship with God that is manifested in love of neighbor. And you make the point that the second half of Romans then turns to the lived ethos of loving one's neighbor, including loving one's enemies, where Paul begins to sound just like the Sermon on the Mount.
And I think one of the quotes that you have on the slide about the one with God is possible kind of through illumination of God being there. And earlier in a couple verses earlier, it talks about God disclosed God's justice. And I think in Romans, this argument in Romans is basically that God reveals or discloses the nature of God's justice through Jesus, and that's what we need to see. And so that's really where the one-ment or atonement comes from.
Now, I'm well aware that for a lot of us, discussing theology for an hour straight starts to break our brain. This is heavy lifting, and I really want to emphasize what a magnificent job that Ted Grimsrud has done sorting out all of these threads. Changing culture is a long-term prospect because culture is buttressed by hundreds of years of stories and justifications and rationale. Imagine how difficult it is, for example, for us here in this country when we are confronted with someone who says, but this is the greatest country on earth, and this is the country that has been chosen by God, and how that narrative is the accumulation of hundreds of years of entitlement and half-truths and history and denial of history. And that's not all unraveled in a few sound bites. And that's also true for atonement theology. It's a big project. And this book tackles every single major piece of that facade and does it in a readable way and I think in a great way. Like any reader, Ted, I've got a few little quibbles here and there with you, but I think you've just done a great job. And one of the last pieces of this buttress is the book of Revelation, which, again, many Christians say, see, this just goes to show that at the end of history, there's retributive justice because God comes and kicks everybody's ass. And isn't that what final judgment is all about? So, undeterred, you also tackle the book of Revelation. What were you thinking, Ted?
Well, I've been a big fan of the book of Revelation now for a long time, and my initial interest in Revelation was triggered by precisely that kind of conversation 30-some years ago. And I discovered that, and I feel this more, and I'm continuing to work with Revelation, I feel this more and more the better I understand Revelation, that that's just the exact wrong reading of Revelation, that Revelation, and that it's actually clear. I mean, Revelation is incoherent, consistent. It's complicated because there's lots of symbolism and we have to kind of use our imagination. But basically, the message of Revelation is there's kind of two kinds of victory that happen. One victory is through violence and domination. The other victory is through persevering love and self-sacrifice. And the second kind of victory is 100% the kind of victory that God wins. And through the Lamb is, and in chapter 5 in Revelation, which is it's kind of just in this one image, in chapter 5, where John, the writer of Revelation, sees this scroll. The scroll, in some sense, is the completion of the whole story, the ultimate salvation. And no one can open the scroll, and John weeps, and then he's told, the mighty warrior is coming who can open the scroll, don't weep. And then what he sees is a lamb that was slain, standing, resurrected. And then this lamb is worshipped by somewhat people, well, all of creation. In fact, I see Jennifer's question here about seeing God's salvation extended creation. Well, I think that the picture in Revelation is absolutely in that the entire creation worships the Lamb and the way of the Lamb. That's how the victory is won. It's not God doing violence.
Right. As a matter of fact, Jennifer, and I believe this is Jennifer Henry of Kairos up in Canada, Revelation is perhaps the best testimony to the redemption of creation because of the portrait of the New Jerusalem being the resurgence and renewal of creation through the waters of life flowing out from God's very being and greening the world and turning the city back into a garden. And so this notion of restorative justice that Ted argues in this book is really, Ted magnificently articulated it in the ending chapter of the book of Revelation, is it not?
Yes, indeed. It's I think and justice. I mean, the idea of justice is there in Revelation very explicitly, and the justice that is talked about in Revelation is precisely that: the restoration and the worship of God by all of creation. And something that most people don't notice in Revelation, in the picture of New Jerusalem, you know, who ends up in the New Jerusalem? The kings of the earth. And so there's this. It's not just the healing of creation; it's the healing of our political world. And I actually am thinking now that one way to actually look at the New Jerusalem is the New Jerusalem really is Babylon, but it's Babylon that is healed.
Right. It's the complete transfiguration of Babylon into a relational, symbiotic world of justice and equity. Thanks for the clarification, Jennifer. It's not Jennifer Henry in Canada. It's Jennifer Schrock in Goshen, who is the great animator of the Mennonite Creation Care Network. So thanks for tuning in, Jennifer. And that's a good word. Well, Ted, we're into our last 10 minutes. So you sort of parody Stanley Fish's question, is there a text in this class? Is there an atonement model in this story? And you then, in your final chapter, reiterate, sort of go back over and sketch what you've tried to do in this book. I really think that you have made your case very well. There's one piece that you address in the very last chapter that I'm glad we have a chance to touch upon. We were talking about this a little before during batting practice. You talk about the notion of providential punishment as a way of explaining much of the violence that appears to be invoked in the name of God in the biblical narratives. Do you want to talk about this? Because I think it's a very, very important idea that helps make sense of some of the most troubling texts in Scripture. Tell us what you mean by providential punishment.
Well, and I want to say I still have a lot of thinking to do about that and how to articulate that. But I think the basic idea would be that I think really throughout the Bible, and again, I think in Revelation, this is a really strong kind of theme, is that there are consequences in the world that this world that God has made. There are consequences when humanity violates the ways in which this world was made to be. That is, like Amos talks about justice as being, or injustice as being, like nature kind of going against itself. That when there's injustice, when there is violation, there are consequences, and that these consequences result in kind of negative outcomes for people. And so in that sense, there is this sense of punishment that people who do hurtful things are hurt. But it seems like the picture, well, I don't know, for one thing, it's incredibly imprecise, and that there is a lot of damage that happens to a lot of people who aren't guilty of violating things. And it's also, of course, a problematic view of God, that God would just reach down and kill people or whatever. And so it seems to me that, to call it providential punishment is basically saying that the world, kind of in the providential care of God, the Creator, this gentle spirit, that the world is such that there are negative consequences, and that in some sense, certainly in the biblical framework, where God is kind of in everything, and so there's sense none of this stuff happens apart from God. And I think what Revelation presents with these visions of these plagues, which I believe clearly are not coming directly from God, but the plague, I think part of the picture there is that these plagues don't defeat God. The plagues are not destroying God's providential care of the universe. And so there's this sense that that this is all part of how God works in this providential, indirect way. Yeah.
An example of this might be found in Leviticus 25 and 26. You draw on the Jubilee tradition in your portrait of Jesus' life. You talk about how his use of the Jubilee tradition and what we call Sabbath economics was one of the many expressions of God's unilateral grace and gift. And of course, the Jubilee texts of release are in Leviticus 25. But in Leviticus 26, we're told that if we do not keep the Jubilee rhythms, if we do not free slaves and forgive debt and return land, then there will be all of these negative consequences. And in one of the verses in Leviticus 26, it says, and you will go into exile, and your economy will collapse, and your land will be given to your enemies, and all these terrible consequences of not keeping Sabbath and Jubilee. And Leviticus 26 says, because the land will keep its Sabbath with you or without you. It's almost as if there's this notion of divine providence, as you call it, as part of the balance of creation. And if we violate certain balances, if because of our um, sin or injustice things get too far out of balance, there will be consequences. And in a penultimate sense, God cannot help us. God doesn't give us a free pass from those consequences. Climate change would be a perfect modern example. Now, in the language of Scripture, as you point out, this is often articulated in terms of God judging us by allowing things or even making things to happen. But that this is a sort of an ancient cosmology that attributes things to God, which modern people might more say, well, that's sort of historical consequence. But when you're operating in a theologically infused universe, you have to say that even behind historical consequences is God. And I just think that's a really important notion that you talk about at the end of your book for us to continue to explore. And I appreciate you raising that. We've got just a minute or two left. Ted, I'd like to invite you just to make your own plug for the book, or say anything that you'd like to say to potential readers of this book.
Well, I really greatly appreciate your affirmation, Ched, and I do hope that the book, I mean, it's clearly, it's a book about theology, book about ideas, but I do hope that it has a flow, that it's straightforward, and that I think the argument is distinctive enough that I think it can hold people's attention in the sense of, okay, where's he going with this, and that kind of thing. But that it's all in service. Like what animates the book is the sense that we have this problem in our world and we need to really do something about it, and that Christianity and the Bible have potential to be really helpful resources to help us address this problem.
Boy, I couldn't underline that more emphatically. As labyrinthal as these conversations can get, we do have a problem with deep assumptions and big, wide cosmologies that are founded on the idea of justice as retribution. And Ted's work is an important part of a wider effort to overturn the hegemony of retributive justice thinking and acting with the deeper, wider, and ultimately prevailing thinking and acting through restorative justice. This is a historic task. It has all sorts of ramifications for our lives and our work, and not just our beliefs. So, Ted, thank you for gifting us with a book that helps sort through a real thorny thicket of theology.
Can I make just one quick comment, because I really like Cleve Slaughter's question about Jesus' death in relation to Martin Luther King's death, and I would just say that to me that I think the linkage there is very valid. I wouldn't equate them, but I think that the part of what I want to try to convey in the book is that Jesus' death opens us up to recognizing that this is kind of a pattern throughout history, pattern both of the life of faithfulness and the suffering, but also the vindication. Yeah. And King would be a great expression of that.
And so we end where we began, talking about King and talking about Passover. We are amidst the great feast of liberation, and let us remember that was a journey that was initiated by God into justice and healing. And as we think of that journey, we also journey through Holy Week, which culminates in Jesus' journey of the Via Crucis, which also, according to the Gospels and according to Paul, Jesus' death was ultimately a gift, an expression of grace to try to teach us the way of restorative justice. Ted, thank you for joining us at a quite late hour there on the East Coast, and we so appreciate you talking to us and talking about this really important work. I also want to encourage people to look at Ted's blogs. Ted, maybe you can just briefly name the two blogs that you keep going, always places for interesting theological conversation.
PeaceTheology.net is where I post longer pieces and articles and that sort of thing. And ThinkingPacifism.net is kind of the ongoing blog, kind of current reflections on issues and that sort of thing.
I don't know how you do it, but you just keep putting great stuff up there to make it democratically accessible to all of us. I so appreciate that, and there's always really good and vigorous conversations on Ted's two sites as well. So if you didn't know Ted Grimsrud's work before this webinar, you do now. I want to again say I think he's one of the most reliable thinkers that we have in the church today, and I really commend his work to you. Thank you, Ted, for joining us. I want to remind everybody that our next webinar is coming up in just a few weeks on Tuesday, May 6th. It's going to be taking a little bit of a different tack. It'll be very, very much hands in the soil. This is going to be happening midway through our Permaculture Design Certificate Institute, which begins in about 10 days. And Sylvia Kiesmat, a New Testament scholar and farmer from Ontario, Canada, and Chris Grataski, a permaculturist and theologian in his own right, from Lynchburg, Virginia, are going to be co-leading the Permaculture Design Certificate course, and they're going to be in conversation talking about farming and permaculture and theology. So this is your chance to get a glimpse of this very exciting PDC that's coming up next month. We've arrived at our hour, and we do like to end on time. Remember, you will get a link to the recorded webinar. If you need to go back and listen to these things again, you'll have the entire recording. Chris White should have that out in a few days. Chris has now put up a little poll if you want to vote about how you felt about tonight's webinar. We invite you to do so before signing off. We're very, very appreciative of your support. Please help us keep spreading the word about these BCM webinars. It's our monthly chance to tackle with issues between the seminary, the sanctuary, the streets, and the soil. So thanks, everybody. And Ted, thanks very much. God bless. And happy Holy Week. We'll leave the screen up as for folks to